This is Housebound. I'm Chris.
I'm Holly.
I'm Ashlyn.
I'm Greg.
And you're invited.
Welcome to Housebound, a podcast we made because we needed company. In it, we talk about things that are on our minds, and today we're talking about how not to read the Bible. Now, I just want to preface this episode by saying that the Bible can be read many different ways and that there can be value in each way. We believe that the Bible is inspired by God, and so it can be a meaningful source of encouragement and comfort, even when used in a way that was not how it was intended. I also want to say that none of us are biblical scholars, and it might be the case that not all of us will even agree. So take what we say with a grain or pillar of salt. I chose this topic because I think that the Bible is one of those super confusing books that has, yes, despite that, stayed at the forefront of the Western world for hundreds of years and has impacted people across the globe. And it continues to be a book that is hard to read in spite of actually having numerous translations in modern English. So I believe that a part of this confusion comes from those misconceptions on how the Bible was intended to be read. And I thought it would be cool just to kind of go over a number of them that have been at least on my mind. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. And I just wanted to, at the start of this podcast as well, just kind of give some credit to Tim Mackey from the Bible Project and Dr. John Walton from Wheaton College, because both of them in their writings or podcasts have kind of impacted at least how I perceive the Bible. So a lot of the things that I'll bring up today will have they'll have touched on in their works or podcasts. So yeah. And maybe another piece that might be important to make mention of is that this all comes from a Christian perspective, but at least I still feel that even those who don't ascribe to a Christian faith who are listening would still find what will be said still something helpful in it. So yeah, I'll just kind of be going through my list, and if you I'll at each point I'll just say a bit, and then feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts or if you disagree or agree, and we can just kind of move forward like that. So
Cool.
Sounds good.
So the first way of how I believe the Bible should not be read is as a hero example book. This, I think, comes a lot from the perception that all these Old Testament stories are these amazing heroes of faith that we can kind of look to with extreme confidence and kind of ascribe that this is how we need to emulate these people. But I think where that tends to fall through is when you look at a little closer at these stories, you start to see that not all of these heroes of faith actually are perfect. They all have their flaws. And I think a part of this comes from, we tend to also think of the Bible that it can be a kid's book. And so for Sunday school, we'll kind of leave out bits and pieces. So like the story of Jonah will be this amazing example of this prophet who told, he saved a city from destruction, and we'll kind of skip out on chapter 4 where he has a bit of a temper tantrum and wants God to annihilate the same city that he preached the good news to. So
I don't like that they listened.
Yeah.
Please kill them anyway.
Yeah. But he was swallowed by a big fish. And so that is great for, children's line of plush items, right? That you can kind of stick in their crib and stuff. So I think that's kind of where we tend to, that we springboard off of that Sunday school ideal and then kind of carry it forward. So whenever we look at the Old Testament, we'll look at, how did Moses show faith that I can kind of emulate? Or even looking at Gideon, we'll look at Gideon as this man that's like, he fought off these people and he did it with only a few men. And he did the whole fleece thing. So that's obviously what we need to be doing constantly, right? Is like asking God for signs, and we'll use that as our example. But if you look at the context of that story, you start to go, oh, wait, he's constantly doubting God throughout it, from the very beginning to even to the war that he is known for. And so things like that. So that's kind of a bit of what I don't think the Bible should be read as this hero example book, because ultimately these people are all flawed. And that's more the point, is to show that God still is going to use flawed people. So,
yeah, I totally agree.
Do you think that they can be used as negative examples as well, though? Like, don't let or emulate the good parts of these heroes, but look at their flaws and don't emulate those parts?
Yeah, and this might get into a bit later on in the podcast in terms of like kind of trying to get to the root of like, why are those stories there? Are they meant to be stories of emulation? Is that kind of the main point of it? But yeah, like I think as a story, all stories you can take the good and the bad, like that, but I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you when you said that, like, the fact that the biblical characters have flaws is what makes the Bible cool, that these aren't amazing people that were like special divine beings almost that God chose to use. But instead they're people with like mistakes and screw ups and problems like everybody else. And God is able to use them. And I think that reading of the Bible where you're like, oh, I just want to be just like David, the Bible kind of almost stops you from interpreting it as if the hero of the Bible are like exactly what you need to strive for, because it blatantly shows their errors and it blatantly shows their screw ups. Like the Bible doesn't try to hide over top of that.
For me as a Christian kid, going to Sunday school from a very young age, they're not going to get into the deep, dark parts of some of these stories. They're gonna give you kind of a general overview of the story, and like there's a character and then there's a situation, and here's how the character comes through the situation. And they don't really dive too far into the technicalities of the story because we're just kids. I mean, give us some credit, I guess, but also understand that kids have a limit and they're not going to be able to necessarily wrap their minds around some of the really, really dark stuff that,
and maybe
that
shouldn't
can happen. Well, yeah, and it's maybe not appropriate. And so I don't think that Sunday school is like a bad thing, and I don't think that they've done us a great injustice by teaching us the Bible through these stories. But it definitely wasn't until I was in high school and beyond that I started to like actually understand. There was some stuff about some of these stories that I didn't realize, for Jonah, for your example, that didn't really click. It wasn't really a part of the story that I was familiar with at all. And there was a great number of stories that I hadn't even heard of because as a kid, I hadn't read all the way through the Bible. And so I'd only heard what was preached on Sunday or taught in Sunday school. And so I think as a result of that simplifying down of the stories, we get this misunderstanding that these stories are about some heroic guy that goes through a situation and comes out the other side. Even if we're not thinking Jonah is a hero, we're just thinking, look at this awesome thing that he did and this awesome thing that he lived through. And so I personally, that's kind of one of the reasons, not the only reason, but I think that's probably part of the reason that we grow up and we have this misinformed understanding of those stories. So I don't know whose necessarily fault that is, but I think it's just interesting to be aware of that so that, if you're a parent with a kid, you can engage in a little bit more meaningful discussions about what they actually learned at church or in Sunday school. And, you can take what they learn and then you can build on that rather than just letting church be the only place that they ever learn about anything about church. And so if they're not taught at church, then they're never taught it, that kind of thing. So
I think it would be interesting too, to have some sort of curriculum where as the kids are growing up, you're teaching them the same stories, but a little bit more in depth each like second or third year or something like that. Like you go through the story of Jonah again in 3 years when they're old enough to understand that like whining is a terrible, awful thing that your parents don't want to hear from you, and God didn't want to hear from Jonah either. Like,
yeah.
But when you teach that story to a kindergarten kid, they're just like, there was a fish.
Yeah.
It was a whale. And you're like, no, it wasn't a whale. It was a fish. Here's a whale. Because that's all they know. Because a big fish is just a whale. That's all. So.
Yeah.
So, Greg, what's your feeling on modernized versions of the whole hero story aspect of the Bible? For example, the rock opera Hero with Michael Tate from the early 2000s, whenever that was, about, Jesus coming in the middle of the 2000s and dealing with what was going on then. And then now Netflix has a new series called Messiah that's about Jesus coming nowadays, like in the 2020s, and what happens then. And I think I haven't seen the Messiah and I haven't seen Hero, but I've read the graphic novel adaptation of the Hero. Let's not get into that. But it's I don't know, what's your thought on like taking those stories, unless you do consider Jesus to be the only one that we can do the hero story for?
Well, I think that like if I think of what was modernized, I think it's only been the story of Jesus that's really been like upgraded to like modern day. I think all the other ones have kind of stayed in the past.
Yeah.
Even like the new Noah movie that Darren Aronofsky did, like it was different, but it was definitively still like based on like I think it was even based on a comic book, which was based off of the Bible story and like some extra biblical stuff. So, so even that, like, while it still is like theatrical and like Hollywoodized or whatever, it still stays in the past. And I think that's where the story of Jesus keeps being brought to the modern day, because the person of Jesus is so impactful for people, and I think people want to visualize, well, what would happen if he was here today? There are people out there who have what they would call like a very personal relationship with him, right? And so to bring him up to the modern day and to bring that story to the modern day is actually, I think, something that is easier for them to wrap their heads around, just because of the fact that the Christian church in the Western world is such like a present thing here. So, yeah.
I think Holly was going to interrupt with Evan or Bruce Almighty being a modernized version
Ooh,
of Noah.
That's good.
Yeah. They were modernized.
Yes, correct.
I mean, there is satirical kind of twist on it, obviously, but...
And there is probably a few other ones. I just think that generally it's the story of Jesus that gets brought up and to the modern day, and the heroes of the Old Testament tend to be left in the past. I don't know. It's fair. I think that's a fair point. But yeah. And I think to Holly's question, and I think it's a good one, is okay, like if these people aren't perfect, can we still glean something from them in terms of even like their mistakes, as this is what not to do? Which I still think would point to that, like, we can't use them as the ultimate role models at the end of the day. But if you are coming to the story of the Bible for help on character building and how to like live a better life, then yeah, I think you can look at both sides of the coin. So
yeah, fair enough.
Cool.
The
next thing that I would say is how not to read the Bible would be, don't read the Bible as a magic 8-ball. And I don't know if you guys have come across this, but it's essentially where, and I will admit that I have done it, but you'll just flip open the Bible to a random page, and kind of sometimes if you're really holy, you'll point your finger to a specific verse rather than having to scan the page to try to find something relevant. But you'll point it to a specific verse, and then that verse will somehow speak to your current situation. Like if I had I should have brought a Bible to this. That would have been perfect. But then I essentially, you could like flip it open to a random thing, and I don't know. And Moses went up to the mountain and spoke with God. And you're like, oh, this is...
I can speak with God too.
And this is a promise of like, maybe like a mountaintop experience. I'm in the valley now, but God is going to take me to the mountain, and I'm going to be able to stand up over this, right? And like something like that, where you'll take a verse that was ultimately not intended for just like to be read fully out of context that way, but you'll use it in a way that, and reinterpret it in a way that kind of speaks to your specific circumstance. So, yeah.
Are there any verses really that are meant to be read out of context?
I don't think so, but
no, that's what out of context means. But that's exactly one of the reasons that I have some issue with, or that I take some issue with some of these worship bands, music teams that shall remain unnamed, but are very popular. And you take that miscellaneous Christianese of the valley and the mountain, and you comparison, and you throw that into a song. Like, what does that even mean? Right. And not that they don't have maybe some good things to say, and not that it's like what you said from your first point, Greg, was that you can look at it for character building, but necessarily not look at it for this is what my main focus should be. So it's not that the songs are inherently evil or anything like that. It's just that sometimes it seems you're just plucking from here and there, making something that sounds good, and suddenly you've got a Magic 8 Ball, or, you know, that life verse, or and it's been taken so out of context that, you know, it's still from the Bible. So, I mean, you can't like, it's still from the Bible. So it's not that somebody just threw it in there just for you to see and say, but don't use this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's so far out of context, and we get wrapped up in trying to determine too much meaning from it, when it actually is the larger picture we should be looking at.
Which kind of ties into my next one. So unless anybody has anything more to say about Magic 8 Balls, we'll move on. Cool.
That's
so
how I decided who to marry.
Yeah. It explains a lot.
I'm just kidding, Christopher.
Signs do not point to yes.
Another way not to read the Bible is as a source of inspirational quotes. So, which is kind of to your point, Chris. While I think it can be encouraging to have verses that you memorize and that kind of speak to you, that really kind of have impacted you, that you've read, and that's great. I think it's just when we have those like stock photos with like the guy raising up his hands, you know, and maybe there's a couple people next to him doing the same thing, and it has like where two or more are gathered, there I am with them, or something like that. And it's like a sunrise, you know, and it's just this amazing.
And it's sunset.
Yeah. But like the problem with that is that if you look at the context of where two or more are gathered, here, just one second. If we look, for example, at the actual context of the where two or more are gathered, there I am with them. What we have, which is actually, for those of you who might have a Bible on hand who are listening, this is Matthew 18, 15 to 20. So, and it says, and here's the context. It says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you and you have gained your brother, then you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them.
Oh, so it's about prayer.
Yeah, and so that is where it seems to be, I don't know, like maybe you guys can let me know what you think the context is, like in actuality. But when I say where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them. After reading that passage, what might he be speaking to specifically?
It seems to be, oh man, I don't want this on public record. Okay. It seems to me that what that is talking about is something more along the lines of not judgment, but discernment in a situation.
Yep.
Which
that's good.
Has several, you have a person that has an issue and refuses to rectify that issue, and so you seek God for discernment in how to manage the conclusion of this issue. And it kind of gives us a very interesting picture of kind of the roadmap of kind of how to start progressing towards resolution, and then steps to take if that person refuses to resolve.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's good because, it talks about like in verse 16, it says that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, right? And then it says, where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there I am with them. So the context is on like witnessing, and it's on, like essentially sin and like somebody who does a wrong to you and how to resolve that within the church body and within the church community, right? And the interesting thing is what follows after where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them. Then Peter comes up and said to Jesus, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many times as 7. So the context continues to roll in terms of that idea of forgiveness and how to deal with that. And so, so it's more on like who to kick out of the church than on kind of a nice, cozy, inspirational moment where like Jesus is present with us. And, since we're all gathered here, it's actually, this is a context of judgment, and which is not exactly as cushy and cozy as, as we might like it. So sorry if I ruined that verse for some people. But yeah, like I do think that that's the context at the end of the day. So
we don't use phrases like who to kick out of the church lightly. I don't know that I've ever more than just now heard that phrase. So
it's true. And that's where, again, like it follows by Peter saying, well, how many times should we forgive somebody? And then Jesus says 77 times of like is how many times we should forgive them. So it's not like the church shouldn't be a forgiving community, but there seems to be specific cases where there needs to be some intense form of like, okay, we're trying to help you grow, but you're actually causing harm to our community. So anyways, so that's one example of an inspirational quote. There's probably many others. I mean, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. That's probably an easier, less controversial one to disseminate a little bit. The context of that is more just one of like them being in exile, right? And it's God clearly saying to these people, I'm going to restore you. And at the moment, we're not necessarily in a Babylonian exile, so it's hard to attribute that to ourselves. But so I wouldn't recommend reading the Bible as an exclusive morality or ethics textbook. And this might be where we might start to deviate a bit.
Explain what you mean.
Yeah. So I would say it is first a story of God and his relationship with humanity. It carries forward then even from the Old Testament into the New, and God's like that consistent thread throughout it. And it's the people who are different. And it's his interactions with them that get recorded. So and even when it comes to the law that we have in like the Old Testament, so like the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, what we have there is laws interspersed with story. And so it goes from law to story, law to story, law to story. And it's not just a list of rules. It's not just a codex of this is how we should follow, because that would be far more practical if it was meant to just be a book of ethics and morality. So, I think one thing that might illustrate this is there's a book by A.J. Jacobs called A Year of Living Biblically, where he takes the Bible very literally. He's not a Christian. He has like a Jewish kind of background in his family, but he then lives out the Old Testament and the New Testament in light of following all the laws that are written in it. And ascribing to all of them. And so as best as he can. And it ends up just being like a gong show. Cause like,
yeah, of course,
he has to then stone adulterers. Right. And so he finds out one guy I think he met in a park, and the guy admits to him, yeah, like I'm sleeping with another woman or whatever. And so then he picks up some pebbles and chucks them at him. Just like small ones, and very, very harmless. But that was the only way that he could like follow that law, right? And so, and still be not in our prison system. So, like that's...
Wait, so which laws was he trying to follow?
Yeah. So...
You got to pick and choose, dude.
Yeah. So if it's just a law book, then it becomes really dicey as to what do you follow, what do you prescribe, and it becomes very pick and choosy. So that I think is why I don't believe the Bible is to be read as a exclusively more morality and ethics textbook. So,
now, what do you say to the discussion around the person of Jesus coming and abolishing the old law, becoming this symbolic and literal new law for especially the Israelites, functioning under the old rules of the old system? Would you not be able to then say, let's look at the Old Testament as this kind of old laws intermixed with stories and just kind of leave it for what it is? And then when looking at the New Testament, taking that more literally than the old? Or is there too much mix over that? I should say, do you feel that there's too much mix over from old covenant stuff that still exists but has been reshaped, and so as a result you have to either believe it all or practice it all or nothing, kind of thing?
Yeah, like I think this was a debate in the early church. Like if you look at the book of Acts, they have like a whole situation where they were trying to figure out, okay, wait, now people who aren't Jewish are becoming like believers of Jesus. Do we get them to, follow all of these things, like not to eat meat with blood in it, and, to get circumcised, and all of these like very like Jewish practices that set themselves up as separate from, people of other nations. And so that was a big deal, and they had to kind of figure that out. And it sort of ended up being that they were kind of like, well, if you do these few things, then I think you'll be okay, and so
compromise.
They didn't make them follow all of the law. They just were like, here's some important stuff that we would still maybe recommend you do, So, and I think that the evidence that debate is there, like it points to the fact that, yeah, that was something that people wrestled with. I do think that when Jesus said, I did not come to like abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, I think what I understand is the law was shorthand for referring to the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books of the Bible, and the prophets was then kind of like the prophetic writings, so kind of the other third of it, and then there was the other part called the writings. And so when Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, he's actually referring to, I didn't come to like do away with the Old Testament. Like I actually am here to fulfill it. And if you look through the Old Testament, you see how it is pointing, at least from my perspective, it appears to be that it's pointing toward a figure, somebody, a Messiah, some anointed king, a priest, who is to be coming, who will inherit the nations. And so there seems to be like a storyline within the Old Testament of this like very cloaked in shadow figure that we don't know too much about, but it's pointing toward that. And that figure does not come by the end of the Old Testament. And so that storyline is kind of left hanging. And then that's where the New Testament comes in, and Jesus is like, yeah, I fulfill those things. Like, so. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So what would you say would be maybe just 1 or 2 ideas of what else you would rather somebody consider as a part of their foundation or their building of their foundation of a moral, or can't think of the other word, of a moral foundation.
Like where should they look?
Based on your comment that you don't think that the Bible should be strictly looked at and then nothing else.
Yeah.
Like, is there something that you would say is required, or just other things that you would say are nice things to consider?
Yeah, I did phrase it in a way that was kind of like, it's not exclusively a moral book. So like, I think you can look to the Bible for wisdom on how to live and act.
Gotcha.
Especially I think with the character of Jesus, because Jesus tells his followers, like, love others as I have loved you. So he is that example of actually like, emulate my behavior, truly be my disciple, right? And so I think I will probably look more toward the teachings and actions of Jesus to determine how I live than the Old Testament, probably for that reason. So, yeah.
Gotcha.
we did it again, guys. We ended up having way more content that we can squeeze into the normal allotment of time. So we're actually going to do a 2-parter. So check out the next podcast for part 2 of this episode.